The Rivals devs recently posted a feedback survey last week, and a few questions caught my eye. The one we'll be talking about today, however, is how strong should a character be at launch? There's tons of different perspectives on this, but I think there's a bit of nuance that the average player doesn't always consider. Today, I'll be breaking down why new characters need to be interesting, why new characters need to release strong, and finally, why new characters should not always be released strong. I know that seems kinda counterintuitive, but it'll all make sense towards the end of the video. To kick us off, let's look at why new characters need to be interesting, or at minimum, stand out from the previous roster. I personally think that all of Rivals' characters are really unique, so I'll take an example from Smash Ultimate. When Byleth was announced as a DLC fighter, a lot of players and fans were not impressed. Sure, he had a unique moveset that no other character really replicated, but his gameplay loop and general feel was something that players were already familiar with. This led to players finding him boring or unfun, not only at launch, but also over time. This isn't to say that Smash Ultimate's unique DLC characters are really any better for the game. Truthfully, between you and me, as someone who competed in that game for a good minute, Byleth was a lot better for the game than someone like Min Min. However, we can't deny that he doesn't feel the most inspired for a DLC character. An easy way to fix this problem, however, is to simply launch the character at a higher power level, creating more interest within the kit. What would have happened if Byleth's moves were less clunky, or comboed more fluidly than other sorties? I'd imagine he'd stand out a lot more and fill in a new niche, without necessarily needing to bloat his kit with a crazy new option. Taking another example from Smash Ultimate, let's compare Byleth's release to someone like Steve. Sure, it's obvious that Steve is overall not a healthy addition to the Smash Ultimate meta, but I'd argue that's more of a design problem, with his moves being overtuned, not that his moves and kit are necessarily uninteresting. His kit had lots of little tricks, like building blocks to extend combos or interrupt recoveries. No ladders were super cool to discover, and the crafting mechanic added a whole new element to the game. Most notably here, Steve released in a pretty strong state, making this admittedly strange and unique character pretty easy to play and pick up, promoting players to not only try Steve, but also pick him up as a secondary or a main. Before I hop off this topic though, I do want to clarify that just because Steve's launch was successful doesn't necessarily mean that his long-term stay in Smash Ultimate has been. I'll expand more on this later on in the video, but just because I think that Steve is really interesting and has a cool design that stands out for Smash Ultimate, a game with almost 90 fighters, doesn't mean that he's overall healthy for the game, even though he did have an explosive launch. If you want my opinion on how this applies to our upcoming Rivals 2 DLC character Abza, I'd say that currently the closest fighters we have to a zoner are Fleet and Orcane, with Orcane not really leaning into his zoning tools in his current iteration, and Fleet being like a kinda zoner. I'm not really sure how to describe her since she has zoning tools, but they're just not the best part of her kit. Abza, however, has multiple ways to create space, through her Cloud, her F-Tilt, and her different forms of neutral special. I think you could argue that this is more of a set play character, but it's kind of the closest thing we'll ever get to a real zoner for now, meaning that no matter what power level, she'll at least carve out a nice niche for herself from gameplay alone, making her a solid option to add to the roster, right now at least. Before I move on to the next topic, by the way, I do want to let you know about a giveaway here on the channel. To get a chance to win the Hockey Loxodont palette with the special Valhalla skin, I don't think you can get it anymore by the way, all you gotta do is leave a comment on this or any upcoming video before mid-June. It's not necessary, but subscribing while you're down in the comment section would never hurt. Getting back to the video though, let's look at why characters should release on the safe side of strong. A good example of this happening and not happening can be seen in Rivals 2, when comparing Olympia and Edeliss's launches. Olympia, as we know, launched quite strong. The power level of the game at the time was overall higher, but I'd argue she was a clear contender for top 1 at the time. This led to her getting 2 solid rounds of nerfs, and now I think most of the community can agree that she's at a pretty good place balance-wise. However, I would argue that her power level being higher at launch, and her being easier to get value from, made her more interesting for a lot of players near her release, since they could swap off their mains and still see success and enjoy a new fighter. I personally think that she was a bit too strong at launch, but it makes sense that the devs would want to launch her strong anyways to make her more engaging. This engagement has carried over through the nerfs, and Olympia is still one of the more common characters popularizing the rank queues. This has all been said without even mentioning the new mechanics that Olympia brought to the game, most notably her gem, which opens up unique movement, but also her crystallization, which gives her new combos and custom kill confirms. These tools, combined with her unique burst movement options, made Olympia feel like a big breath of fresh air, especially compared to the pre-existing Rivals 2 cast. And I'd argue that definitely would not have been the case if she launched in an underwhelming or weak state. Edelus, on the other hand, kept kind of the opposite launch of Olympia. He came into the game super underpowered and didn't really receive a lot of fanfare at all. Players that I talked to that wanted to play Edelus found themselves swapping off of him, with even them being discouraged from playing the new Fuzzy Friend. It wasn't because they didn't like his kit or how he played, it's that he was simply so underpowered and not interesting compared to the rest of the cast. Why would you swap off the character you had been playing for the last few months to play a clunkier, weaker character that's lacking anything notable to make them stand out? Sure, he had his new freeze effect, the frozen shield, and the ice on the ground, letting him slide around, but all of these mechanics were either so underpowered or so difficult to take advantage of that they weren't really useful or worth it at all, coalescing into an overall uninteresting character at launch. Of course, I am looking back on this with 2020 vision. Arguably, Edelus is also kind of in a good balanced state right now, even though he's still one of the weaker members of the roster. But his player base has never really materialized. Sure, some new players have picked up the bear, but he's still one of the rarest rivals to spot out in the wild. I imagine if his launch was in a stronger state like Olympia, players would have gravitated towards him and slowly fallen off as he was tuned, instead of no players being drawn to him at launch. To wrap this point up, I think that characters should release in strong states. Not necessarily broken or unbeatable, but strong. If I were to decide where to put a character at launch on a tier list, I'd aim for top 3 to 5 range to promote players into trying them out, and then nerf them over time to align them with the rest of the cast. There's also things like emergent tech, like Edelus's Flat Stanley, that got patched out earlier this month. That kind of tech doesn't really show up until players have had their hands on the character and are familiar with them. I think it's especially important to keep a character fluid at launch, since limiting this kind of tech before a character's launch can slim the character down to being a boring, less expressive version of themselves, before there's a real chance to see the tech used by the greater player base. Now that I've talked about why a character should release on the safe side of strong, I want to talk about situations where they probably shouldn't. Normally these discussion videos from me are pretty cut and dry. I see people talk about something, I give my take on it and cite various things to back it up, but when it comes to character launches, there's a few cases where characters might need to break the rules and release a little bit on the weaker end of things. First, let's take a look back at Steve again. I know I said I'd move on, but the big problem with a game like Smash Ultimate dropping an absurdly strong DLC character is that the game simply isn't frequently, regularly, or, as we know now, not at all updated. This led to the character not just having a month or so of fun dominating the meta, but multiple years, with no real end set in sight. This is inherently unhealthy for the game long term, meaning that Steve probably should have released in a slightly underpowered state. The same thing happened with the character Mauga in Overwatch. Devs normally take a few weeks off for Christmas at Blizzard, but they left players with a super overpowered, really unfun character for the break. This meant that for over a month, players were stuck with an absurdly broken tank, dominating the game and rendering a good portion of the cast either unpickable or unhelpful. This leads me to outline that if a game doesn't get patched often, characters might be better off aiming for a middling power level, instead of shooting to make a big splash at the top of the roster. Another reason why characters might want to release on the weaker end is if there's a big esports event coming up soon after their launch. If there's a big event, flipping the meta on its head probably isn't super smart. Players spend hundreds of dollars on airplay tickets and travel, hotels, event fees, and food to make it out and play in massive tournaments. This means that for the event to run fairly, players should probably have around 3 to 4-ish weeks to play on the current patch, or a patch pretty similar to what they would play on for the event. This means that if a character is added to the game, let's say a week or two before a large event, they should probably release on the weaker side to be safe. I've seen some people say that this is why Edelus got added into Rivals 2 in the state that he was in, and why he didn't get buffed right away, since they wanted to keep the patch leading up to Genesis pretty samey to the last one. I'm personally of the mind, however, that players did have enough time to get used to Edelus, seeing as it was about 3 or 4 weeks before the bracket that he launched in the game. Another solution to this problem is to simply ban the new character in major competitive events until they've been out a week or two or been tuned back. I know this might ruin the hype cycle a bit for some players, with them not being able to see a new fighter used at top level right after launch. But I'd argue it's a better solution than releasing the characters so weak that they can't function, or so strong that they ruin competitive integrity for a big event. Abza actually might have this problem since she releases only a few days before GOML, so it's really up in the air on what the devs will choose to do. For my final condition on why a character should release on the weaker side is if their kit is either super annoying, or has crazy complex counterplay that's really hard to master. Let's take Min Min from Smash Ultimate as an example here. Her kit is super unique for a plat fighter. She's got so many tools and is the only character that plays and controls the way she does. I imagine she would have been much more enjoyable as an addition for competitors if she released in a lower powered state, since the state that she released in was clearly way too strong and also super unfun to fight. Truthfully, between you and me, I think her design is just bad overall, so I would dread fighting her even if she was weaker. But I don't play Ultimate anymore, so I'm all in the clear, that's y'all's problem now. That just about wraps up all my points on why the DLC characters are more interesting when they launch on the safe side of strong and with a unique kit. Let me know if you think I missed anything here, or if I got anything wrong. Thanks tons for watching until the end, and good luck with the Loxodon skin giveaway. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye for now.